Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show on News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO. Thank you for tuning in today. Joining us on the phones right now, good friend of the program, Patrick Svitek with the Texas Tribune, who's been covering the statewide politics and also the presidential candidates as they crisscross not only the nation but Texas as well. Patrick, good morning. How are you?
Doing good, Chad. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've been busy covering all the politics. Texas, again, it should surprise no one. Texas is a major state in this presidential cycle among the Democrats. And we're seeing that already, aren't we? We're seeing the Democrats coming out and campaigning all over the state, really.
Yeah, it's been pretty remarkable. The state has already seen visits from, I'd say anywhere from a half dozen to a dozen candidates out of the 21 or 22 person field. I know it's growing by the day, which is kind of unusual for candidates to visit this early and often ahead of the primary. And it's not only, unusual how often they're coming, but it's also kind of the events they're doing. I mean, typically you think of, if a candidate's going to come to Texas, honestly, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, usually the fundraise.
Right.
Make no mistake, they're coming to Texas to fundraise this cycle, and that in many cases is their main purpose for being here. But they're also adding on some of these, public events, doing some rallies of their own, appearing at local party events, and doing kind of the kinds of events that you don't expect to see this early on in the cycle, usually at all, in a presidential race in Texas. And so it shows that, they at least see some of the value to not just coming here, raising money behind closed doors and leaving. They see some value to holding some of these more public events, building up some goodwill with local party leaders, and trying to reach out to those Democratic primary voters who could, decide their fate when Texas holds its primary in, I think, less than 10 months. So, yeah, I mean, it's sort of an interesting development just in terms of how often, how many, and then again, what kinds of events they're having here. Do
you think this is, obviously the Texas Democrat Party itself, I think they were pretty fired up with the performance of Beto O'Rourke. Obviously he didn't win, but it still fired up Texas Democrats. Do you think that momentum, obviously it's had to have slowed down since. Do you think it's having an impact on that momentum and on that I guess excitingness that the Texas Democrats had? Is this, with the candidates coming into different parts of the state, is it amping up that Democrat voter base?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the baseline for all the excitement this cycle is what you saw in the Senate race last year, seeing Beto O'Rourke get within 3 points of Ted Cruz in that race, a really remarkable achievement. And then there's been a number of events since then that I think have continued to encourage and amp up Democrats. For example, what you're seeing at the national level, where national Democrats have named 6 GOP-held congressional seats in Texas as targets in 2020. You're seeing national groups zero in on the U.S. Senate race here in 2020. You're seeing some, at least one prominent candidate, MJ Hager, get into that race to run against John Cornyn. And so, yeah, I definitely think that a lot of this is still kind of residual momentum from Beto O'Rourke's race, but you've had some developments in the meantime that have continued to give Democrats hope that the state is finally seriously trending in a politically competitive direction.
Yeah, visiting with Patrick Svitek of the Texas Tribune. What about the Texas Democrats running for president? What are they up to these days?
Yeah, they're out there kind of grinding it out. Obviously with Beto O'Rourke and Julian Castro, take Beto O'Rourke first, as we've talked about before, he had this very highly anticipated launch about 2 months ago in mid-March, and a very kind of just chaotic opening stretch in terms of the media attention, in terms of the crowds he was getting. He was polling relatively high. I wouldn't say he was necessarily in the top tier, but he was polling toward the front of the pack, I would say. And now 2 months later, he's kind of settling into a more conventional kind of position within the field. He's, really just one of, over 20 candidates, working to kind of distinguish himself now that attention is not as naturally flowing to him, and now that he's not just kind of every day being treated like a celebrity, basically. And so we wrote a story this week that kind of summed it up perfectly in saying, that he's kind of come back down to earth. It's not that his campaign is like, collapsing or in serious trouble, but he's certainly no longer flying as high as he once was. And I think that, he's realizing this is a long haul, and, not every day you're going to be the hottest candidate in the field. And a lot of this work often happens away from that intense media spotlight. And so he's been hitting the road, and I think his greatest asset or greatest kind of strength so far is that, free from any kind of day job, he's been able to campaign aggressively. And I think by some counts I've seen, he's already traveled, kind of covered more ground than any other candidate, or he's at least covered more ground than many other candidates. He just did a 5-day trip to Iowa that was jam-packed. He went to Minnesota the next day. He's now in New Hampshire for 3 days. And so he's traveling very aggressively, continuing to travel very aggressively. You mentioned Julian Castro. As we've talked about before, he's been at the bottom of the pack in terms of polling, in terms of media attention, for a while now. And he's still, I think, fighting for kind of his breakout moment. He saw a little kind of uptick in media attention over the past few weeks with the release of an immigration platform. And then he hit the 65,000 donor threshold to secure a place in that first primary debate next month. But he's still kind of, I think, fighting for kind of his spotlight in the race.
Visiting with Patrick Svitek, Texas Tribune. Patrick, anything new in the race between MJ Hager and Senator John Cornyn? Are we expecting, or are you hearing any other any relative big names that may jump into that race?
Yeah, so the latest development in that was the San Antonio Congressman Joaquin Castro deciding not to run after, for a period at least, looking like he was pretty likely to run. There are still some potential candidates out there. There's a member of the Houston City Council named Amanda Edwards who continues to look at the race. And even after Castro got out and MJ Hager got in, Amanda Edwards said she was continuing to consider a run. Another name that continues to come up is Royce West, who's a Democratic state senator from Dallas. I'd say both him and Edwards are kind of the two remaining prominent potential candidates. But right now, I think it's fair to say MJ Hager is kind of the most high-profile name in the race. She hasn't had the most action-packed start. I think on Tuesday or next week will be kind of the 3-week anniversary of her campaign. And she hasn't done much. She hasn't done a lot of media appearances, hasn't done an actual campaign event from what I can tell. She's made a couple public appearances at other people's events. But so far it hasn't been like a necessarily kind of an intimidating start if you're another Democrat looking at getting into this race. And so I think she still has a lot to prove. And like I said, we're waiting to see what Royce West and Amanda Edwards do. I think probably those would be the two most kind of prominent, outstanding potential candidates.
Has there been any talk whatsoever of any prominent Republican challenge to Cornyn in a primary?
No, there hasn't. And as of right now, it looks like, it looks unlikely that he's going to face any kind of serious primary challenger. I think there's a few different things for that. I think his campaign did a good job of, not too long after the November election last year, lining up some pretty key endorsements that made clear that kind of the state's conservative leaders were on his side. He unveiled endorsements from Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor, from Ted Cruz, the junior senator, and then he ultimately was endorsed by President Trump. And in today's Republican primary politics, you're as good as gold if you have the support of the president, because as we've seen in some of these races, it's no longer in these Republican primaries, especially in red states like Texas. It's not really so much ideological anymore. It's about, are you kind of loyal to the president? Are you going to be supporting the president's agenda? And so having the president's endorsement is kind of the ultimate validator of that. And so I don't see at this point Cornyn drawing a serious primary challenger.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. Let's take a look at what happened last night. It was a big deadline in the Texas House where, what was it? If a bill had not been passed on second reading, it's, as we know it, dead, correct?
Yeah, so midnight last night was the deadline for the Texas House to pass House bills on second reading. It's kind of the first major cutoff point for legislation in the Texas House. And if your bill doesn't is not taken up and passed before that midnight deadline, it's effectively dead. But as you kind of pointed out, there's a big asterisk there. A bill is never dead, as we say, in Austin. And you could see some of these bills or language related to these bills amended onto other bills later in the session, or come up in other forms. And so there's other ways for these measures to kind of have a second life later on in the session. But their chances of seeing the light of day after midnight last night go down significantly.
Yeah, was there anything major, or at least you had the talk about the Chick-fil-A thing, but I mean, was there any major pieces of legislation that went down last night?
No, there wasn't. I mean, there was some bills that got, I would say, moderate attention from the media here. But in terms of the big issues this session, the things that the governor has named a priority, the things the lieutenant governor and the speaker have been focused on, there was nothing that they waited to take up until late last night, and nothing that was at risk of dying. You mentioned that Save Chick-fil-A bill, which was taken up last night, and it ultimately went down on a point of order, which is a procedural maneuver to raise kind of a technical concern with the bill. So that bill that bill died last night. But to be clear, it wasn't necessarily a major piece of legislation being pushed by state leadership. It was more of kind of a priority of social conservative groups and kind of more socially conservative Republican lawmakers. And it marked an early significant win for the new House LGBT caucus. They were the ones, one of their members, Julie Johnson, had been the one who had launched these points of order against the bill that ultimately brought it down. So an early win for them, but in terms of the overall trajectory, the major issues this session, it wasn't too consequential.
Were you surprised, before I let you go, Patrick, were you surprised about the rise and fall of the sales tax swap issue, and how quickly, and I mean, I guess it didn't really play out as quickly because we've known about this discussion for well over a month, but you had the big three who came out with this press conference last Friday, and then by Tuesday of this week, it's dead. We're not moving on with this issue. Were you surprised by the quick death of that?
I wasn't totally surprised, just given that I always assumed that it would be a little uncertain that they'd be able to cobble together 100 votes in the House, which is what they needed in the House, and that would have required some Democratic votes, and they had pretty much ironclad Democratic opposition to it. So in the House, I'm not surprised that that's kind of the trajectory that it ended up being on. In the Senate, which tends to be more fiscally conservative in terms of the Republican caucus, definitely not surprised that there wasn't an appetite for it there. I was interested, I don't know if I want to say surprised, but I was interested in kind of the dueling approaches to the issue by the Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, who tried to project unity with the other state leaders behind this plan, and then also his top political ally, Paul Betancourt, who was kind of the voice of opposition in the Senate to this plan. Some people have portrayed it as kind of a falling out between two longtime political allies. I think it may have been a little more strategic than that, to be quite frank with you,
really?
Given how close they are. It was, I thought it was you could look at that and see it potentially as kind of a good cop, bad cop situation. And so I thought it was interesting to see that dynamic play out in the Senate, which clearly factored into, its ultimate demise.
Yeah,
for now, though.
For now. I mean, as we saw in the House yesterday, to me, this is going to be a big campaign issue for Republicans. It's going to be a big campaign issue for Republicans, not only in a general election, but also in a primary, Patrick. I think that, again, not everybody was on board with this. You had conservatives versus conservatives. You had moderate Republicans versus moderate Republicans. Forget about the Democrats for a minute. Not every Republican on the ideological Republican scale was with each other on this. And don't you think this is going to be a big issue in primary battles as they shape up going into the next election?
I do, and I would add, too, that I think that perhaps they could be a bigger issue in the general election where Democrats, and this is particularly pertinent in the State House, where Democrats aren't too far removed from the majority.
Yes.
You're going to have these battleground races in the State House where now Democrats can say, last session, top Republicans in Austin wanted to, raise the sales tax, hurting all these middle-class families. where was your Republican lawmaker on this? Now, I'm sure some of those Republicans will come out and say, I never intended to support that. I never voted for it. But it's still, I think it can still be used pretty devastatingly as a point of pressure in those general election races. And like you pointed out, too, I mean, anytime a sales tax or any kind of tax increase is on the table, that's always going to be a potent issue in a primary race. So I think you're dead on there.
Yeah. All right, Patrick, what are you working on moving forward over at the Texas Tribune's website?
Yeah, with that sales tax swap kind of in the rearview mirror for now, we're continue to be focused on how the state leaders are going to be able to pull off school finance reform, property tax reform, and property tax relief, which is what that sales tax swap had been aimed at providing. And so it's now a big open question about kind of where they're going to find the revenue or the money to be able to provide actual property tax relief with that sales tax swap dead for now. And so that's a big open question going forward. I think we have 17 or 18 days left, and so it should be a dramatic end of the session in that regard.
Absolutely. Patrick, as always, we appreciate your time and encourage folks they can go to texastribune.org to read up on all the latest. Patrick, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chad.
Have a good one. That's Patrick Svitek, texastribune.org.